So, why are oil and gas so important to the United States and especially to Texas? Well, the first reason is that here in the United States and especially in Texas, we consume a lot of oil. So, one thing that, as we talked about before, because oil is so central to the world's economy, whether you can manufacture things, whether you can drive from place to place, whether you can ship things, whether you can fly, places that are a bigger part of the world's economy tend to consume more oil. And as the world's biggest economy, the United States consumes the most oil. We also still, unlike places in Europe, have a big manufacturing capacity, and we also have, we drive around a lot. So that means we consume a lot of oil. And so the U.S. is about a quarter of the world's economy, and you can see that it's about a quarter of the world's oil use as well. Now, this is an older map showing oil use around the world. The size of the circle indicates how much oil is used in different places. One thing that you can see is that at this time, the U.S. used more than twice as much oil as China. Since that time, China is consuming more and more oil as its economy grows. But the U.S. is still by far the world's leading consumer of oil. What about the production side? Well, on that side, you see also the U.S. is the world's biggest producer of oil. Not only is it the world's biggest producer of oil now, but historically, the U.S. is where most of the world's oil was produced, and for that reason, that's where oil and gas law developed. When oil and gas law developed in the first half of the 20th century, the U.S. just dominated world oil production. That's why Japan went to war with us during World War II, because we stopped sending them oil, so they didn't have the oil they needed. And that is why once the U.S. was in the war, everybody expected the U.S. To win, because that meant that all that oil production came in on the side of the Allies. What you can see here from this chart of oil production by country over time is that, years after World War II, for years, the U.S. produced more than half of the world's oil. What happened, though, is that in the 60s and 70s, other countries like the USSR and countries in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, and especially Saudi Arabia, caught up with and eventually surpassed the U.S. in oil production. So the U.S. Is now a much smaller percentage of oil production, and some of those places produced more than the U.S. from 1972, basically through just a few years ago. But what's happened in just the last few years is that the U.S. has become, again, the world's biggest oil producer. Now, we know that happened because of fracking, and we'll talk about that process in a little bit, but it has really revolutionized world oil markets. So where do we stand today? Well, again, this is a chart from a couple years ago, but we basically have three major producers of oil in the world that each produce over 10 million barrels per day of oil. That is Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the leading producer, the United States. Then we have a second tier of major oil producers that include countries like China, Canada, Iran, and Iraq. And then we have a bunch of other producers that are important oil producers, but not really in that first or second tier, like Nigeria and Norway. So that gives you a rough sense of how oil production is distributed across the globe, but I want you to look at what's happened just in the last 10 years with the rise of production from fracking in the United States. And to understand this chart, which runs from 2008 to 2017, what you have to understand is that oil production is the dark bars, so those dark blue bar representing the United States, orange bar representing Russia, and red bar representing Saudi Arabia, and then those light bars are representing gas production. And what you can see here is that in 2008, Saudi Arabia was the world's leading oil producer, and Russia was the world's leading natural gas producer. But in the years after 2008, fracking led to more and more production of oil and gas in the United States. And so you can see by the end of the chart, by 2017, the U.S. is the world's leading producer of both oil and natural gas. So there's a huge change in global production. Now, for those of you who prefer moving pictures, here is, in 30 seconds, the last 120 years of oil production. What I want you to notice is that up until after World War II, the United States just dominated world oil production, producing as much as 70% at times. But starting in the 1960s, the rest of the world, the USSR and those countries in the Middle East, caught up and then surpassed the United States. The fall of USSR, it falls back. Saudi Arabia becomes number one. And then Russia again reaches number one. And what happens in just the last year is that the US becomes again the world's leading producer of oil. Now, how does that happen? Well, it happens because of fracking. And fracking is actually a word that is used as a shorthand to describe a whole suite of techniques that is designed to extract oil and gas that is trapped in shale layers of rock, which are rocks that are impermeable, so oil and gas can't flow through them. And so the oil and gas is trapped in tiny pores throughout that rock. Now, we talked about normally the way oil and gas is formed is it's formed deep under the earth when heat and pressure compress organic matter to create oil and gas, and it bubbles up towards the surface until it hits the surface or hits a cap rock. But shale is where that oil and gas was never able to bubble up towards the surface because the rock was impermeable, so it couldn't travel through that rock, and so it's still trapped there. And we've known for decades that if you could somehow crush up that rock, that oil and gas would be released from it. But the problem is we didn't have any affordable and effective way of crushing up the rock in those layers to release that oil and gas. What fracking has done is showed us how to do that. And the basic process is that you have to drill down, often more than a mile, till you enter that shale layer, which in this diagram is depicted in purple. And then at that point, you have to what's called kick off, so move sideways and drill precisely through that layer of rock, threading that whole layer, which may only be 20 feet thick, for possibly another mile or further. And so it's only recently that we've been able to drill so precisely that we can do that. After that, you send down explosive charges to put initial fractures in the rock. Once you have those initial fractures, you send down water. And so fracking is really short for hydraulic fracturing, using water to crack open that rock. Now, once you've cracked open that rock, obviously you want to stay open so all the oil and gas can flow back out. So mixed in with that water is also sand. And so you can see those little sand molecules hold those cracks open so that the oil and gas can flow back up the well and to the top of the well and can be extracted. So that's the fracking process. Now we'll talk more about fracking throughout this course and some of the concerns about it, but some of them are also shown on this diagram. So one concern is that every time you drill an oil gas well, you drill through a water table, and that water is used for many purposes, some agricultural, but also for drinking, etc. And there are strict regulations that determine how you drill through that water table so that you're not supposed to do anything that could possibly contaminate it. But nonetheless, every time you drill through that water table, there's some risk that something would go wrong or that somebody would do something wrongly. And as a result, you might have some kind of contamination of the water table. Now, when EPA has studied this, they say that doesn't happen very often, but there's always some risk. There's also a risk, of course, that when you get all that oil and gas back up, it's mixed with water. You have to store that wastewater on the surface, and there can be dangers that wastewater is going to be released to water, to the surface water or to the water table in ways that could cause problems. There's also been concerns that that wastewater, what you eventually do with it is you inject it back in the ground. And you store it safely there. It's supposed to be stored safely, but there have been concerns that sometimes when that wastewater is injected into the earth, there have been earthquakes that have followed that up. And basically, the scientists aren't exactly sure why that is happening yet, but one of the theories is that some of that oil and gas may include, that wastewater might include lubricants that basically cause seismic areas that are already on the verge of slipping. They lubricate them and cause them to slip a little bit, and so that's why you're getting those small earthquakes. So that's some of the concerns that are about fracking, and that's the process. Now, there's also sometimes controversy about the term itself, and so explaining that controversy is a little bit difficult because different parts of the oil and gas industry feel differently about that term fracking. So sometimes the PR folks, the public relations folks, and the sometimes you call it strategic affairs, which basically means public relations, don't like that term fracking. And so I've got an example here from an Associated Press article where an executive from Chesapeake Energy, which is a company that does a lot of natural gas fracking, says that journalists shouldn't use the word fracking. He says it's a co-opted word and it's a co-opted spelling to make it look as offensive as possible. You know, obviously, frack is sometimes even used as a substitute for a swear word, and certainly the protest signs write themselves. You know, don't frack our planet, et cetera, et cetera. And so this VP for Chesapeake Energy, who does strategic affairs, public relations, and government relations, he says it's a co-opted word, don't use this term. You should refer to what it really is, which is directional drilling, threading that layer, and hydraulic fracturing. And so you shouldn't use this shorthand to describe it. Now, the reason that I'm going to use it and that most people in the industry use that term fracking is because it's the shorthand that describes a process everybody knows refers to these separate techniques that produce oil and gas from shale layers. And to give you an example of one company that uses that, here's one from the exact same company, Chesapeake Energy. So Chesapeake Energy was saying, don't use the term fracking. It sounds offensive. It sounds like a non-gentle process. And then here, a couple years later, Chesapeake declares Propageddon with a record frack. They call it the era of the monster frack has arrived. They refer to it as Propageddon. In fact, I think they ultimately said, what we're doing here is unleashing hell on every gas molecule downhole. I think that's a Gladiator quote. So clearly, this is the VP of operations. So their VP for Chesapeake Energy, same company, their VP of strategic affairs, their PR guy say, don't say fracking. And the person who actually runs operations in the field is saying, yeah, we're doing monster fracking now. So obviously there's a little bit of a disconnect. The reality is that most people in the industry use the term fracking, and so that's why it's the one I'm going to use in this course. But just be aware that some people, particularly if they're on the strategic affairs, public relations side, might not like that term. Sometimes they insist that it's really short for fracturing, so it shouldn't have a K in it, so it should just be Fracking. But the most common thing is to spell it as I do here. All right, so where is this fracking new production taking place? Well, it's taking place in these what we call plays, which are geographic regions where in a certain layer of rock, people are investing money to extract oil and gas across the nation. And in this map, what you can see here is that plays where what they're looking for is gas, so they're fracking for gas, are in orange, and plays where they're looking for oil, but there's usually some natural gas with it, are in light blue. And so you can see that the biggest source of natural gas fracking is in Pennsylvania, and that's the Marcellus Shale. That's where a lot of fracking first took off in a huge economic way after 2008. But what I want you to see here is if you're looking at oil, actually the most important formations are several different formations here in West Texas in what's called the Permian Basin, and those formations have different names: Delaware, Bone Spring, Wolfberry, etc. And then here in the Eagle Ford, also in Texas, that's sort of just east of San Antonio and Austin, and then also here in North Dakota in the Bakken. And so those are some of the big places where oil production can happen. There's also an important natural gas formation. There's less drilling here now, but right here in Dallas-Fort Worth in the Barnett Shale. And that was another important place where a lot of these techniques for fracking were developed. Now here's a little bit closer look at Texas. You can see again in the Permian Basin on the border with West Texas and New Mexico, those different formations where there's a ton of oil production happening. The Barnett, where a lot of this was developed in the mid-2000s, and the Eagle Ford here just south of Austin and San Antonio. What you can see here is the relative importance of some of these formations in terms of oil production from 2004 to 2018. And you can see the Eagle Ford is very important. It's a big super field. The Bakken in North Dakota, that's that green, is also extremely important. And then there are a couple from the Permian, Strawberry, Wolfcamp, Bone Spring, and so you can see that red, blue, and that brown. Those are also leading to a lot of production. Actually, it's the leading producing area. It's the biggest oil producing field now in the world is that Permian in West Texas. Now, as you can see, since so much of that production is happening in Texas, Texas has achieved an extremely dominant position in really global oil production, but certainly within the United States. So if we look at crude oil production by state, we see that Texas is producing massively more than any other state. So this is in 1,000 barrels per day. You can see Texas in red. And what you can see is that Texas got to over 5 million barrels per day until it started closing some oil wells with the downturn in the economy that happened recently. So just in the past months, Texas production has fallen, but still remains far, far higher than any other state. The number 2 state is New Mexico, which, remember, shares part of the Permian Basin with Texas, and that's where it gets its big production. Number 3 is North Dakota with the Bakken. So what you can see is that, if you go back just 10 years ago, the big producers, it was always Texas, but Texas was producing just a fifth of what it produces today. And then otherwise it was California and Alaska. What's happened now is that we have these North Dakota and New Mexico have been the biggest producers. The other thing that this chart shows is that offshore production, which is through the federal government, remains a very important source of oil production throughout. So producing about 2 million barrels a day. Now remember, this is just a massive amount of production. This increase in Texas, no country in the world has ever increased its oil production as fast as just the state of Texas did during this period. And it's an incredible amount of money. I mean, if we talk about 5 million barrels a day of production, remember, if we're talking about $40 a barrel oil, right, you're talking about $200 million a day. I mean, that is a staggering quantity of money, and there's a staggering quantity of investment that's come into Texas to produce that oil. And so it's a really remarkable story. We've never seen anything like that in the history of the world. You might have seen old movies about oil booms and people making fortunes. This is beyond any of that. It's truly amazing, an order of magnitude bigger than anything that's happened in the United States before, and about almost 7 times bigger than anything that's happened in any other country before, including Saudi Arabia. So it's been a massive boom over the last 10 years. Okay, turning to natural gas, which you'll see is a similar story, which is a lot of increased production in those shale areas. Here, the big one is the Marcellus in green, as we see mostly in Pennsylvania, but shared with West Virginia and Ohio. You can see increased production in some of those same oil fields because often natural gas is trapped with those oil molecules in those tiny pores in that impermeable shale rock. And so sometimes when you get oil, you get gas as well. And you can see here the Eagle Ford is an important area of increased natural gas production as well. You can also see the Permian here, another important area of oil production, but leading to some gas production as well. And we'll talk about some of the problems that happen when you are getting both oil and gas from the same well. That'll be a major topic during this course. If we look state by state, we can again see Texas, again, number 1. Texas is the leading natural gas producer and has been for decades, but Pennsylvania, because of the Marcellus, has caught up and is now a close number 2. So when you think about what are the important jurisdictions for whose law matters in oil and gas law, number 1 for both oil and gas is Texas. But, places like Pennsylvania are important. North Dakota is increasingly important for oil and gas. Because Alaska and California historically produced a lot of oil, they can be important too. One thing you see is Oklahoma law has tended to be extremely important because Oklahoma is often seen as a contrast to Texas, even though economically it doesn't produce nearly as much. So those are some of the important jurisdictions that we look at for oil and gas law.